Greetings and salutations. This is Abe Abdelhadi with the Bitter Truth, where we may not have all the answers, but we're going to ask an awful lot of questions. You can also become a bitter pill at patreon.com/the bitter truth and get some freshly toasted bumper stickers for your toolbox or guitar case or whatever. They're good, high-quality vinyl, and you can put them on your car. Today, we've got an incredible guest. I'm happy to have known him for a very long time, very good friend of mine. Dr. Adam Brown is an assistant professor at the Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College at City University of New York, CUNY, to those of you who live in the area. In addition to that, he's also got a private practice, and he's often a featured speaker who's also published articles in various reviews and journals, and he focuses his field of study is the prevention of sexual abuse and delinquency, and also focusing on treatment of the youth with sexually harmful behaviors, and also working to create an intersection of child welfare and juvenile justice. He also gets into family treatment as well. And Dr. Brown, are you there?
I am. How are you?
I like to say Dr. Brown. That's really cool. I've known you for a long time, so it's just nice to say Dr. Brown.
You've known me before I had the title.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I know, but it makes it fun. It makes me sound smart. It's like when I say my sister-in-law, I didn't do anything. It's my brother's wife, but I sound like more mature because I have a sister-in-law. So it's like, I got some friends that are doctors, and they have this to say, so fuck you. But listen, hey, we've known each other since I think 2000, 2001. But let's get into I know your background, but for the listener, let's kind of get into how you ended up doing what you're doing and where you're at now.
Sure. So I'm a clinical social worker, and that's really how I identify myself first and foremost. And so I got a master's of social work, and shortly with my first job after getting my master's a number of years ago was in a foster care setting in Massachusetts. And I should say that when I started social work, I really went into it because I had a very successful experience in my own psychotherapy. My psychotherapist was a social worker, and I thought, boy, I'd really like to do this, be a therapist, and that was really what started me on my journey in social work. But when I got close to graduation, I needed a job, and it's very, very rare that somebody could go straight from an MSW program straight into private practice. And the job that was available to me was in a foster care agency in the state of Massachusetts, and it happened to be the only foster care agency in the state that accepted kids who had committed sex offenses. And so very quickly, 100% of my clients were these kids who had committed sex offenses. And so my work and my view on what social work was about for me started to shift very quickly. And working with these kids, I kind of went into it with what I imagine a lot of preconceived notions that a lot of people have, or that these were going to be these scary, severe cases of kids that nobody really wants to work with, and were probably pretty hopeless cases, and kids who were just going to end up in jail for the rest of their lives. And what I discovered, by and large, were that these were just boys, and boys who, in almost all cases, came from profound abuse and neglect in their lives. And while many of them had been sexually abused, not all of them had been sexually abused, and it wasn't really easy to just explain that the reason that they committed a sex offense was because they had been abused. I discovered it was just a lot more complicated. Mm-hmm. And the more complex I found it to be, the more questions I had for people in the foster care system and in the government and my own supervisors. And the more questions I asked, the more annoyed people got with me because nobody had good answers about how we could do things differently with these kids.
And you're that guy, by the way. You're just that guy.
I am. I ask a lot of questions.
Why? Why come we can't have nice things? Yeah.
It's true. And so I was lucky enough to have had a mentor from my master's program who said, I think you should really go get a PhD. And I said, geez, I don't think I could get a PhD. And he said, sure you can. And and so I applied, and I discovered that, in the process of training in my doctoral training in Chicago, that I could become somebody who got to ask questions and do some research and hopefully answer some questions in a much bigger picture than I could as a boots on the ground clinician and case manager in the role that I was in. So that's kind of how I ended up where I am now, and now I'm an assistant professor, and I am doing research and writing articles and teaching clinical social work and psychopathology, and I'm also able to do assessments and which I do in Massachusetts at the Institute for Sexual Wellness, as well as from here in New York.
Okay.
So that's where I'm at now and how I got here.
Okay. So when you talk to these kids, I mean, obviously, I'm a layman in these matters. I just read articles and stuff. Obviously, you mentioned it a second ago that a lot of these kids come from an abusive background, and I want to get into it. It's obviously more complicated than that. But what demographic do you see playing into it more? Is it low income, mid income? Are they all white? Are they? I mean, what demographic do you find with a lot of these kids? Because you also do stuff for the court system too, right? Like a kid gets assigned to you by a prosecutor. Okay.
Yeah, well, that comes up. Yeah, I mean, it certainly does vary. I mean, when I was in foster care, full-time practice, it's mostly poor kids because it's mostly poor kids who end up in the foster care system.
Right.
And you're more likely to get caught up in the court system in general if you don't have money and connections. So I found that. I think in aggregate, the research doesn't necessarily point to a socioeconomic bracket of kids who are more likely to have committed a sex offense. So I can say that in terms of demographics.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier, that the poor kids obviously end up in foster care. They're more likely to end up in foster care than, say, even a middle class kid, or kid with two parents in the home or whatever. When you see, I mean, are you privy to the result of say a 16-year-old kid gets busted doing something, and you obviously have to do the assessment for the court. It's court ordered, if I'm not mistaken. And at that point, are you aware of the outcome of his trial or anything like that?
Well, yeah, it depends. Sometimes I am. It just depends on the case. When a lot of times I'll do an assessment and then I pass it along, and it becomes part of the treatment recommendation for a kid. It's and sometimes the court considers that, sometimes the court doesn't. But I have found myself in situations where I am giving recommendations to the court on risk level for kids. But this is very complicated because we would all like to know how safe we are from people that we're assessing who have done bad things. And the problem with the assessments particularly for youth who have committed sexual offenses is that the assessments aren't very good at predicting. What we know for sure is that the vast majority, 90% or more of kids who commit sex offenses don't go on to commit them again, and especially go on to commit them in adulthood.
Wait, repeat that again? I want to make sure we heard that correctly. Say that again?
The vast majority of kids,
okay.
Upwards of 90% or more who commit a sex offense as a young person, as somebody young, under the age of 18, does not go on to commit a sexual offense in adulthood.
Okay.
And that really goes against what people commonly think about this. We assume that people who commit sex offenses do them for these reasons that are really devious, and there's something wrong with them psychologically, and that they are just destined to go on and to continue to do all of these terrible things to people. And that's just not what the evidence shows. Okay. Even without treatment, these kids are not very likely to go on and commit sexual offenses in the future. Now, many of them will go on to commit other types of criminal offenses for reasons we're not really clear on. But even for that, we don't know that it's even most of them do that.
Sure. Well, let me ask you something real quick, though. I mean, you're saying that a vast majority of these kids don't go on to commit sex. Could it be that the nature of their crime isn't that of, say, a pedophile nature? I mean, like, let's just say, as for instance, like a 16-year-old kid gets busted, with an 11-year-old girl. Maybe he's in an arrested state of development. He plays too many video games. He has no social skills, and he thinks this girl likes him, and he doesn't know any better. But then he's going to get busted for that. Do you find a lot of those kinds of cases where it's like kids with a one-off experience, and they're not real predators by nature? I mean, or what is your research shown on that?
Most of my cases are more likely to fall into that than kids who commit serially, who are true predators,
right,
who are going after lots of different kids. Yeah. And you bring up pedophilia, and pedophilia, it's an important thing for folks to understand. There is a difference between being a pedophile, which is a psychiatric diagnosis, and you have to be 18 in the first place to get that diagnosis. But there are certainly 16, 17-year-old kids who commit, who have a sexual attraction to underdeveloped children, people who don't have secondary sexual characteristics, and we can't diagnose them as having pedophilia, but they would qualify.
Okay.
But so my point is, there's a distinction between pedophilia, the psychiatric diagnosis, and then molesting a child, and they're two different things. And often, when we're talking about adults, the motivation is in part of sexually abusing a child is in part influenced by having pedophilia, but there are plenty of adults who have sexually abused children who are not necessarily pedophiles. And it's important to know that there are plenty of people who have pedophilia, that is, that they are interested in children sexually, but that they know it's not okay, and that they don't want to hurt a child, and they don't want to put themselves at risk legally, and so they never commit sex offenses. And that's just an important distinction for people to understand.
Sure. Well, I mean, and that's the reason I ask is because, anyone under 18 obviously is still a minor. And then, the reason I asked that question about the repeat offender type model is just because it sounds to me like a lot of the people you see, and I could be wrong, but it sounds like a lot of the kids that you see under 18, because you don't deal with any adults, do you?
I do. I mean, I don't do a lot of adults. I have assessed adults. I've worked with adults. There was a time I worked in a clinic for a while when I was in Chicago, where I did group treatment with adults who had committed sex offenses and were just getting out of prison. And I do assessments on adults. I feel I'm not able to speak with as much authority on adults, but I certainly have experience working with them. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. And that's the reason I was asking about the kids, because it just seems like you get, like you said, a 16, 17-year-old who, is maybe his curiosity gets, I don't know. I'm not an expert. I'm just, spitballing. But, and he gets busted the one time. Obviously the court system for a kid is pretty traumatic. You go through it the one time. He's like, oh shit, this I could be in jail. This sucks. And so, and maybe it snapped him out of it or whatever, or maybe he just represses it and just carries it the rest of his life and doesn't do anything again. But you're saying in your research and your personal docket, because at this point you've got enough of a microcosm study of enough people to determine whether or not they're going to be a repeat offender as an adult. And you're saying that these kids usually don't turn 90% of them don't turn into repeat offenders. Is that about accurate?
Yeah, and that's what the research tells us. I mean, that's not me just going off of what my personal experience is as a clinician. And even though I've worked with hundreds of young people and I have some sense of, I can speak anecdotally from what my experience is. I think it's more important to really just see what the research has shown, and it is just overwhelming that these kids don't go on to commit sex offenses as adults. And this brings us to an important policy issue that comes up, because in many states, kids get put on sexual offender registries. and in some cases these are publicly available, or they become publicly available once the kid turns 18. Mm-hmm. But you can commit a sex offense at age 14 in some states and end up on a publicly available sexual offender registry for the rest of your life. And the problem with sexual offender registries, whether we're talking about adults or children, is that while they were very, very well intended, we have now had them in effect long enough. The first sex offender registry went into effect in '94, and there is plenty of evidence now, and nothing demonstrates that these registries have prevented a single sexual offense. And in fact, what these sexual offender registries do, and particularly we have evidence to show that they do them with youth especially, is they increase the likelihood for non-sexual offenses. And why is that? Well, it's because that once you're on a registry, you have a lot fewer opportunities for things that we all need to succeed.
Right.
You have restrictions on where you can live, on where you can go to school, and there's increases of vigilantism because people find out who you are, and they make all sorts of assumptions about who you are because they've been watching CSI.
Sure.
And they have these assumptions about the demons who get associated with a sex offender status.
Right. Well, and that's the thing too. I'm glad you brought that up now. I was going to bring it up later. My concern about the sex offender registry has been just the lumping in. And people get mad when I say this, but I think as a crime, and I'm not being a smartass, I'm just honestly, I believe this. I think as a crime, rape should be measured in degrees like we do with murder. We have a first-degree murder, we have a second-degree murder, we have manslaughter. Obviously you've got the serial rapist guy who's obviously got some problems. That's the first degree. The second degree could be an aggravated assault, a date rape kind of a thing, where he didn't intend to do it, but it turned out that happened. That's going to be a mitigating circumstance compared to, say, a planned out serial guy who grabs joggers into a van and that kind of thing. And then the third degree, could be something like, a he said she said scenario, where we don't want to demonize the victim, but we also want to take into account that if the guy does get convicted of a third degree, it's not the same thing. Here it is 10 years later, she's saying he was raped. There was evidence to support it. He got convicted, fine. But he doesn't get treated the same way as the guy who, raped 15 women in a van, hit them in the head or whatever when they're jogging. And so my challenge with the sex registry was always that so some guy ends up on this thing because something happened when he was 16, like these guys you're saying. And then they compare it to a serial pedophile who, was the ice cream truck driver pastor at the church, right? Who molested 75 kids. They're on the same registry with the same consequences. Yeah. And one could argue, well, if you're the victim, you wouldn't say that, but we do have degrees of murder. And as such, I do believe we should have degrees of sex crimes. I don't know if that's...
well, in some states, there is a tiering system. And the Adam Walsh Act, which is the most recent iteration of the federal sex offender registry, the major iterations of the sex offender registry federally were the Jacob Wetterling Act, which was the first one in '94, named after Jacob Wetterling, who was an 11-year-old boy who was abducted in St. Joseph, Minnesota, in 1989. And then right after the Jacob Wetterling Act went into effect, Megan Kanka was a girl in New Jersey who was abducted, I believe, from her home, and she was sexually abused and murdered by a man who had committed sex offenses in the past. And now, I think 2006 is the year or the named year of the Adam Walsh Act, and many people know who Adam Walsh is because his father, John Walsh, started that show.
America's Most Wanted.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So, So that's now there have been a few other pieces of legislation in between there, but those are really the three major ones. And what the Adam Walsh Act did was it made a tiering system. So it's similar to what you're talking about, where they try and put the most severe or highest risk guys on tier 3. There's tiers 1, 2, and 3. And it also included having youth be put on the registry. And so partially, I think, for a lot of states, the reason why Adam Walsh has not been is not the law of many states. A lot of states have just said we're not gonna use this, is because of the juvenile piece. Because fortunately, a lot of lawmakers have been educated enough to know that putting youth on these offender registries is just doing a lot more harm than good. So it's a long way of saying that there is some attempt to tier, like you're saying. But a problem with this is just because it's new and it's not really well defined, and things get really sloppy.
Sure.
So when I was working in Illinois, for example, with adults, I was doing file reviews for some of my patients who I was doing group, and I was seeing that some guys, they were a level 2 sex offender, or let's say they were a level 1 sex offender in the state of Illinois, and then their PO came by and was checking off boxes, filling out the paperwork, and he checked off that the guy's tier 2 instead of tier 1. And the guy didn't catch the mistake, and now all of a sudden he's got this whole new set of rules around how he can live his life because he's been thrown into a different tier.
Right.
And that's not that uncommon to see, just the sloppiness with which this tiering and how arbitrary it can be. And then who's the one deciding what tier?
Right.
The state of Massachusetts, which is where I was trained, their sex offender registry board, the SORB, they don't have, or they didn't when I was there, they didn't have a single person on their panel who had experience or expertise in working with youth. Yet they were deciding what tier to put youth on who had committed sex offenses after they had been sanctioned. And yet there's this overwhelming silence. Nobody's coming to bat and saying well, what are we doing about this?
Right.
And I think it's because there is so much fear and stigma and what it means to have committed a sex offense.
Sure.
And so nobody really wants to stand up and defend these guys.
Right. Well, let me ask you something. I was going to ask this later, but you brought it up kind of now. That's I mean, I've known you for a long time. I've always regarded you as someone with the patience of Job, right? Because you are just a very even-keeled, calm person, right? And so different from me. And but and when you get into the minutia, I suppose this question kind of answers itself. But to those of us on the outside, I'm not even a layman in these matters, right? I just I'll read some stuff here and there. Unfortunately, I got some friends with some experience in this, and you go, oh shit, okay. How do you? But you brought it up a second ago because these people just don't do anything. How do you keep your own values? Because you have a kid. How do you keep your own values apart from these people you're assessing? I mean, you obviously are going into it with a very individualistic, per case mindset. But are there sometimes when you're just looking at this guy going, you're just a fucking mess? I mean, how do you do? Yeah. And do you have that challenge? I mean, or do you handle it?
Yeah. So you're asking, how do I, if I understand correctly, you're asking me how do I sit in the presence of some people who have done just horrific things and treat them compassionately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like, how do you separate your own values out of the matter? Because we all say the same thing. Jesus Christ, if that was my kid, whatever.
Right. Yeah. So I don't know that I do separate my own values. I think first and foremost that I just try and see. I try and acknowledge that we are more. All of us are more than the worst thing that we've ever done, and that. We all have complex histories, and we all we all have these narratives that precede us, that have brought us to the places and influenced our behaviors and decisions along the way. And while I have worked with some men and even a couple of kids who have made my skin crawl, and even in some cases really scared me. I mean, I remember working with one guy once. I did an assessment on him, and he was just the things he described doing. He really terrified me, and I remember him leaving the office and just thinking, "Oh my God, I hope he never runs. I hope he never runs into anybody again."
Right.
This is a guy who I just wanted to be locked up, but there was really no reason for him to be locked up.
No legal reason.
No legal reason, right. He was just engaging in a lot of dangerous behaviors that were very high risk. I mean, so I've had that experience. I guess this is a long way of saying I've had that experience, certainly, but mostly I don't. Mostly, the guys that I'm working with, I experience as pretty vulnerable themselves, and in many cases, who feel really have a lot of regret and remorse about what they've done. And so I try and empathize with the human part of them, and I just don't see them. I see them more holistically. Okay. I just don't see them as the worst thing that they did.
Well, and to play devil's advocate for a second,
it's harder when I have a kid. It's true.
Sure. Well, yeah.
Especially
it changes.
My kid's age.
Yeah, I mean, shit. I don't have kids. I started empathizing when my friends started having kids, and then when my brother had kids, I mean, now it's like, oh shit, that's like, it's kind of weird. Like my niece looks like my mom at that age. Really, like your gene pool's replicated. Right. Going shit, and then there's the other level. Right. It's not even my kid; it's my niece and nephew, and I worry about them. They're not even my kids. I worry about them all the time, and so it's like, I just, I think it does play into it. I think having kids, having a personal attachment to kids, does play into it. But the thing I was going to ask you really quick, just to play devil's advocate, you mentioned earlier that a second ago that these guys have a lot of remorse. Is that because they got caught? I mean, that's always the other thing you hear too, right?
It's a good question, and in some cases, that might be true. And in some cases, in a lot of cases, I think that they were really that they've been So, but are they feeling bad because they've been caught and now they're embarrassed and ashamed? Yeah, that's certainly part of it. But then sometimes also the process of getting caught also forces them to become more aware of how their behaviors are influencing others.
Right. So kind of like an addict, right. Like they kind of have they don't want to do it, but they did it, and there is some remorse of what they did.
Yeah, or they didn't even really think much about how it impacted the people who they were doing it to. And, I was listening to an interview just this morning with a guy who is a pedophile, and he got arrested for accessing child pornography. So he has no hands-on offenses, and
that's a good. There's a joke there. I'm not going to do it, but there's a joke there.
Okay.
There's a joke there. I'm sorry. Well, I'm not going to.
All right. Well, I'm not going to do it either. Yeah. So.
And by the way, as a side note, you could blame Dr. Brown for me accosting your ears with this show because he's the one who got me into stand-up comedy 16 years ago. It was his idea. So, and it turned into this show. So there you go. Anyway, but
you're one of the funniest people I know.
Yeah. Well. I'm going to cry.
Yeah.
But okay. Yeah. So even though they haven't committed an offense, they got busted with the child porn.
So that is an offense, though.
Right.
Right. So yes. So they haven't committed a hands-on offense, and yes, aside from the fact that there might be a joke there, it is an important distinction.
Sure.
Right, because it's an offense nonetheless. Because when you access child pornography, you are contributing to the harm of children because somebody made this,
right.
With you, the user, the viewer in mind.
But they also, but don't they? And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but don't they also get put on that same registry?
They do. Yes, they do.
Wow.
Yeah, and they stay on it forever. And, and it's interesting because with the guys who access child pornography, you were brought this up earlier, and you're absolutely right that there is something different between different, like we like to put this umbrella over anyone who's committed a sex offense and call them sex offenders. And it's just they are a heterogeneous population and heterogeneous in a whole host of ways, including the types of offenses that they commit.
Right.
First of all, the vast majority of guys who commit sex offenses do it against kids or individuals who are well known to them. So they are family members or acquaintances. Right, we're talking more than 75% fall into that category, right, where they're committing offenses. So again, another argument against the sex offender registry is it's like the person who abuses your kid is far more likely to be, your uncle or your neighbor or your kid's school teacher or coach than it is to be some guy who just happens to wander down the street and, I think you used the example of the ice cream man with the fake ice cream man with the van, right? So, so I forgot where I was going with that. What was your?
Well, you're talking about types of offenses and that.
Oh, right. Yeah, and so I remember leading this group in Illinois, for example, where I had a very high-profile priest who had committed over 70 had over 70 victims that he admitted to, and it could have been more than that. And in that same group, we had a guy who had just done a couple of years for child pornography. We had another guy who was like one of these much more rare cases of a stranger rapist, like one of the guys who would jump out of the bushes and grab women, which is quite rare, but they exist. And, so there were 4 or 5 people, or there are probably a total of 8 guys in that group that I'm thinking about. But just in those 3 guys alone, very, very different people, right? Different profiles of people, different motivations for committing the sex offense. Yet we throw them in the same sex offender group because they happen to have committed crimes that involve sex. And it's problematic. We do the best we can as treatment providers to give everybody what they need and hopefully, help them. But it is problematic that we're comfortable just throwing guys in together under one umbrella simply because the crime that we're talking about involves sex.
And it's not a popular point of view to say what we're saying. I mean, I can't tell you how many I have. At least 10 times in my life I've had this point of view on the rape degree thing for about 10, 12 years now. And I must have said this, you couple of beers, start talking shit, trying to impress the girl with how smart you are. And then you bring up that theory. Nothing will repulse a woman faster. And you just...
Yeah. Well, you may want to rethink your...
Yeah, it's not a good dating approach, right? Why am I single?
Yeah.
But in all seriousness, though, it's just like they would just get angry and you go, well, wait a minute. And how is the serial physically violent guy the same as the number 3 guy? Why are they all lumped into the same thing? Like, I don't know. I mean, I think there's an adequate punishment for a crime. I believe that. But why do people, like you said, why are they going to lump everybody into this one category? Like, which kind of brings the other part, the question I was going to ask you later, in your research and in your research and also, in your personal assessments, because you've done like hundreds of cases at this point in your career. Because you always hear this from the fucking Christians love to do this shit about pornography. It's pornography. It's the fault of the porn people. How much does porn play into? Because to me, it just seems. I mean, aside from the capitalist / slavery aspect of a business, taking advantage of women and paying them money to do stuff, how much does porn play into this sort of stuff? Is it the chicken and the egg? It's like, I'm sorry, hit the mic. It's the chicken and the egg. It's like, did the porn create the guy, or was the guy there and then the porn just exacerbated his situation? How much of that does outside media play into it?
That's probably an important question that I don't think we really know enough about. And porn itself, the accessibility and the use of porn has changed so drastically just in the last 5 to 10 years, right? It wasn't that long ago that it was a really big deal just to be able to for a kid, say, to be able to access like a Playboy magazine or a Penthouse magazine, right? And now that same kid at age 10 or 11 who might have, found an uncle or a dad's magazine tucked behind the bookcase in the basement, now that kid can just get on an iPad and watch really graphic porn, right?
Yeah.
And so we don't know yet what the impact of that is on kids or on sex offending. There do exist data in the world, and there's been published studies that include things like pornography in terms of how they influence or might factor into people's offending, but we don't really have any strong conclusions about what it means. A lot of the guys who get caught for child pornography specifically, which is not, accessed in the same way that more mainstream pornography is, or pornography with adults. Because there's another layer of, right?
You got to look for it, right? Because I just go.
You got to really be very deliberate.
Yeah,
about finding
I just go on Pornhub and it's all there. But I imagine if you're going to find something like this, you got to go to work, right?
Yeah. I mean, you do. You have to. There are forums that available that you can go find, and you start doing enough searching around. I mean, even that old, it's I think it's still done mostly through file sharing, like what if you remember Napster, which I think I don't know enough about technology to be able to speak authoritatively on this, but I'm pretty sure that that's the way that all gets done, is through these private file sharing services.
Sure.
But a lot of guys who get arrested for possession of child pornography don't necessarily have hands-on offenses, and so it is an interesting question on what do we do with these guys, treatment-wise, therapeutically, because if they don't have any hands-on offenses, it's possible that their treatment needs are quite different from guys whose judgment is different enough that they heightened their risk, and that they put and that they were willing to harm others in the process of getting their sexual needs met.
Is that a wiring issue, though? I mean, and I only ask because I got a cousin who's gay, right? Came out in the 70s. We were both like 14. Arab dad, Brazilian mom, not easy. And this was before Will and Grace, and before it was like cool. So he had a lot to deal with, and he was in Orange County, California, which is kind of conservative. And he had a few friends that they all kind of bonded together and kind of band of merry malcontents and did their thing. And he went to college, whatever. Now he's grown up my age, whatever, and he's got a boyfriend now, I think like 10 years. But when we were kids, it was pretty clear, right, that he was wired that way. And by the way, just a preface, I'm not comparing being gay to being a child molester. That's not my point. My point is that he was wired to be that way. So when he finally did come out, when he was getting in touch with his sexuality, and thankfully for him, instead of repressing it, he just came out and said, I'm gay, and that's it.
Yeah.
And looking back on it, when I was a kid, stuff that I was attracted to, was women. Liked them. I was 4. I didn't know why. I just liked them. It was a chick. Right. It was a chick that wasn't my mom.
It wasn't a choice. You just remember doing it.
It was like we lived in this apartment building when I was like 3, and we had this nurse that lived above us. Her name was Carol. I still remember exactly what she looked like, and she had this little green MG, and she would take me to get candy, and I was just like, "Fuck, I love Carol." I didn't know why I loved Carol. I just loved Carol. I knew the sound of her car. I'd wait for a couple of cartoons to go by because she was a nurse, so I knew she was coming home from work. So I knew at 3 years old she had to change her clothes, so I got to give her a little time. I'd wait for a couple of cartoons, and then I'd go running upstairs, and she'd be like, "Oh, there's my boyfriend," and she'd like pinch my cheeks. I had this little Ricky Ricardo haircut, and she'd ask my mom, and thank God my mom just got it right. She's like, "Can I take him to get candy?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure." And I remember when we moved away, I was bawling, like I just cried, like, "Where's Carol?" My mom's like, "Oh, she'll come visit us." And they weren't friends. I didn't know this until I got older. They were never friends. She just liked me. And, they had nothing in common. My mom's married with a kid. She was single and hot in the 60s. But all that to say that I remember, and then as I got older, I liked a lot more people that, looked like Carol the nurse. That was just sort of my thing, right? And so my cousin, he knew when he was little that he liked boys. He didn't know why either. But then puberty kicks in. He's like, okay, right. I kind of know why I like boys. So those are normal to me, normal natural tendencies. Obviously he's homosexual. To me, that is, people can argue back and forth if it's normal or not. He's not hurting anybody, so I don't give a shit. I think he's fine. But those are acceptable forms of sexuality, right? You hit 18, you're dating other people your age, you get older, you whatever, you get relationships. So, but when you're little and you're wired a certain way, and then you keep getting older, and then you're still wired maybe that way, like maybe when you're a little boy, you like little girls, but then that doesn't change, and now you're 16 and 20 and 50, and you still like little girls. That's where it's a problem. Is that, and that's a long discourse on this one question. How much of it is a wiring issue? Yeah. Is it wiring? Is that a fallacy?
So the science points us towards the answer being yes, that it's a wiring issue. This is still something that's contested. I will also say it is not my area of expertise, although it's something that I am close to, and I read the research on this pretty closely because obviously it's my field. And, there are some who believe that you can be cured as a pedophile, that with enough treatment, and they often will start with anti-androgen or testosterone blocking medications to minimize sex drive while they're doing treatment, and then over time, when they get involved with age-appropriate potential sex partners, they'll ease up on the testosterone blocking medication and see how, because it's reversible. Once you stop, your sex drive comes back, your sexual functioning comes back. And there are plenty of men who will say that they are cured of pedophilia. I think that makes sense because it's a socially acceptable response. Nobody wants to be associated with being a pedophile for very good reasons. But the science seems to point more in the direction. When I say science, I'm talking about brain imaging that is in a lab by a man named James Cantor, who is a research scientist in Toronto. And he's done the most work on this in terms of brain imaging. And it looks like guys who are pedophiles, their brains look a little different. And so, and what he would say is, although it might be a crude analogy, it really is a sexual orientation. Where just like for you as a heterosexual person, you are just naturally inclined to being attracted towards opposite sex people, and your cousin who's homosexual, and he's just naturally inclined. It's not something that he made a choice about. It's just something that he felt. Mm-hmm. There are some people where the wires get crossed and they see a little kid, and unlike the majority of us who have these kind of parental instincts, even when we don't have kids of our own, as adults we look at kids, and if we saw a little kid, our voice naturally rises. When we talk to them, we get cutesy with them. We try, we want to be helpful and gentle with them. There are some people who see those same kids and something kind of romantic and arousing gets stimulated in them, and it's just a very different response. Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't mean for everyone, like I said earlier, who has that response is going to act on it, but there are a lot who do. And we don't really know why, but that seems to be the case, that these guys just look differently and that it is a sexual orientation. And I think if we can accept that, and we could imagine what it might be like to have a sexual orientation of our own, or take our own sexual orientation and imagine that we live in a culture
where it's illegal,
where it's illegal, where we can never talk about it, where we can never express it, where we can't even talk about it with a therapist because we're afraid of being outed. which you can talk about it with a therapist because it's not reportable unless you've done something.
Right.
Just having the interest is okay to talk about in therapy, but most people would not out of fear. Sure. And if we could have some empathy for these people as a sexual orientation, we might be doing everyone a much bigger favor socially if we can figure out a way to work with these guys and help them. Obviously, while also never making it okay for them to be sexual.
Well, that was my next question. I mean, I kind of cringe a little at the use of the term sexual orientation because that almost normalizes that. I mean, and the argument could be made, well, 60 years ago, being gay was a criminal offense, and now we're okay with it. When does it stop? That bullshit. And so if we use the term sexual orientation in this arena, then aren't we validating that a little bit? I mean, that's my only, well,
it's a label, Abe, right? Yeah. So we can. I certainly don't think you're going to have anyone in the scientific or clinical community ever validating validating is different from making it okay to act on, right? Okay. So you're not going to hear any strong arguments from anyone that it's going to be okay for adults to start having sex with kids, to sanction that somehow, sure. Right? You're not going to really hear that from the scientific or the psychological clinical community, right. But that's different from maybe acknowledging it as an orientation that needs to be dealt with. And so I do think it's distinct. And yes, it gets very dicey when we call it an orientation and we're acknowledging that homosexuality was a sexual orientation that was not acceptable at all, even up until through the DSM-3. It was considered it was a diagnosis. You could be diagnosed with having homosexuality. It was something to be treated, right? It was a pathology. Right. And now it's no longer, considered pathological because it's consenting sex between two adults, and there's nothing pathological about that, right? So this is not the same thing. We can still say it's a sexual orientation and say it's pathological. We can hold both of those things together.
Fair enough.
And treat people with empathy, as opposed to trying to separate. Well, I think I'm done with that.
That's okay. Well, and let me ask you another question then, really quick, because you mentioned, that you guys, or not you guys, but that the community can actually. There's pedophiles that actually claim of being cured. Is there a recidivism rate that we know of where that's not true?
Well, again, so the pedophilia is different from committing a sexual offense. Okay. So the recidivism rates among men also adults who commit child molestation, those rates are also quite low too. Okay. And so whether or not somebody's been cured from the attraction towards children is a different question than whether or not somebody has ceased to commit offenses. Okay. So those are two distinct things. And I think that while there are lots of men who have committed child molestation, sexual harm against children, and who at one time said that it was because they were pedophiles, and now they've been through treatment and they say, oh, no, I'm cured of that. Again, I am really sympathetic to why they want that to be true, and I hope for them that it is true. But in my experience and in the science that I read on it, it just doesn't seem to be really supported. Sure. So, and that doesn't mean I'm not rooting for them to continue to never have an offense against a child again. Sure. But what goes on in their fantasy world, I'm not convinced that they're not at least continuing to have some attraction towards children, because I just don't think it goes away. Yeah, and that's the point I was going to make was, and again, this is not the same thing as child abuse or pedophilia, but and in California they just
had a bill on the. There was an action, not a bill, but an amendment that the state Senate signed. 2 pages. It was only 2 pages, making anti-gay camps illegal. Mostly because the research has shown that those things are ridiculous. There's a ridiculous suicide rate out of people that participate in those things. So obviously they can't anti-gay people, and so that was that was kind of my roundabout asking that question about if they're quote cured. Obviously, they don't act on it, but we obviously will never know if they still have those fantasies or not. But the common sense would say that they probably still do. Because we all kind of are wired that you mentioned it a second ago. If what I did was illegal, I would probably still do it, and that's the truth. I'd join a group. I'd have my own Stonewall, bunch of kinky people at the Stonewall. Absolutely, because it's like you can't date a girl and just have her be in a black thong with only a ribbon around her boobs. That's illegal. Well, it's kind of how I'm wired. So, yeah, put me in jail. That's hopefully with a bunch of women. But that's the thing is like if for years and years and years when for example homosexuality was illegal, people found their ways to get around it. And painful that it was. It's just what it was. But again, to your point, it's not sanctioning it. We're not going to have NAMBLA be a lobbying group, right? I mean, so
that's right. Yeah. That's right. Not one with any legs or support. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But I think just like we have discovered. I mean, you bring up I think more evidence to support why I don't really buy that pedophilia is something that can be cured as a sexual orientation is what we're seeing. Like, no matter how hard certain groups have tried to cure people from being homosexual, they've discovered that not only does it not work, but the outcomes are much, much worse for many. And thankfully, we've evolved culturally to where being homosexual for most of us is socially acceptable. I don't think that we're going to get to a place where it's going to be socially acceptable per se to be to be a pedophile. We're never going to get to a place where it's going to be okay to sexually abuse children. But if we can get to a place where we have empathy for people who are oriented or wired to be attracted to children and help them manage this so that they're not harming any children, I think we're going to be a lot better off. And I think that we'll probably have lower rates of child sexual abuse as well.
So, as far as like not necessarily jail, but like the devil's advocate argument, well, why can't we just have these folks institutionalized for the rest of their lives?
Why can't we have people who have pedophilia institutionalized the rest of their lives? Well, I think because again, I think people are more complicated than that, and I think that we're more than just our sexuality. And just because you're attracted to children, if you're not acting on it, there's no reason why you can't otherwise have a very successful, pro-social, robust, loving life. You're not going to be able to have sex with children ever. That's just not going to be part of your life. Right. But aside from that, there's really no reason that you can't have an otherwise very good life.
Sure.
It's a pretty big thing to take away, that is, expression of sexuality, but it is what it is.
It hurts other people.
Institutionalizing them would be... I don't think that would be in anybody's best interest.
It just hurts other people. And then, wrapping up the next few minutes here, we got, and I know you're not a religious scholar, but you mentioned earlier that you had a priest that had like 70 offenses to his name, and there's something. It's some record obscene. If IBM had this many sex offenses, they'd have been closed a long time ago. It's like 40,000 cases in the United States alone. It's a ridiculous amount of people. Now, if it was one or two guys want to make a few bucks from the church, okay, great. Okay, but that's an awful lot of people. And and celibacy was just an idea that Pope Gregory came up with in 1190, right? So it wasn't like, it was even biblical. Paul makes a suggestion that, hey, listen, if the ministry's, what you want to do, being married is going to be kind of a pain in the ass. I'm paraphrasing, but you may want to just be celibate, single. That's the suggestion. There's no commandment. There's no anything. But Pope Gregory ran with this at a very illiterate time, and just said, okay, nuns and priests, because he was tired of a priest dying and then his wife taking over the parish. Can't have that. So in the next couple of minutes that we have here, what are your thoughts on the church getting modern and getting rid of celibacy in the priesthood? Because the Episcopalians don't have this problem. You know what I mean? Like the Jews don't have this problem. The Presbyterians don't have. They just don't have this problem. So it's like. So what are your thoughts on that as we're closing?
Well, my thoughts on it are, and I, as you say, I am not a religious scholar, but my thoughts on it are, asking any group of adults to maintain an oath of celibacy, it seems kind of crazy to me. And I don't think... I think we have to be really careful in how the conversation moves forward, but I don't think there's any coincidence that we see so many priests with all of these incidents of child molestation, when I think we see, for many of them, we see I think that there are a certain number of priests who maybe chose the priesthood because they knew when they were young people that they were gay, and that this was never going to, they were raised in Catholic environments where they knew it was just never going to be okay with their family, with their community, and that going into the priesthood might have been a real earnest attempt to live a celibate lifestyle. And because they knew that being homosexual was never going to be okay. And then at some point along the way, the access to children and being able to having the trust of the community and the confidence, and that they found themselves abusing boys, not necessarily because they're pedophiles, but because they had boys who access to boys, and chose to act on that. We also have plenty of priests who have sexually abused girls as well. I know, yeah. And part of why I preface it with being really careful is because I do not want to conflate, which is done far too often, homosexuality and pedophilia. Right?
Absolutely. No, I agree 100%.
Right.
Yeah.
So I want to be really clear about that, but I don't think that's a coincidence. And I think if you removed the oath of celibacy, this problem would evaporate for the Catholic Church within the next generation. Sure. I don't think that we'd necessarily see any more or fewer or greater incidents of child abuse than we do in other sectors, professional sectors, if we just removed this oath of celibacy. It's really kind of absurd to me.
It's 100% absurd. I mean, it's not even biblical. I got early release for time served out of religion, so I get it. I probably forgot more Bible than most people know. They get pissed when you bring that shit up, though. I mean, not they. I mean, a lot of Catholics do. And I'm like, well, Gregory made it up. He fucking made it up. It's like, it's not even, he had a vision. How convenient you have a vision. Was anybody else there? No, it's just me and my vision. Oh, fuck you then. Go to the woods, drop some peyote buttons, and see if the vision changes. Anyway. Well, folks, seriously, Adam, Dr. Brown, this was really good. I really appreciate you coming on.
Oh, well, I'm really glad I did. Thank you for inviting me.
Not a problem. And folks, as always, Patreon.com/The Bitter Truth. You can become a bitter pill, get some freshly toasted bumper stickers, and we're going to be introducing more tiers in the new year. But for sure, if this stuff makes you uncomfortable, it's supposed to, so sleep tight.